Good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Irina, for inviting me to give this keynote. It's my pleasure to be here. I did my master's at this department, at this faculty here, so it's always a special feeling to be back where I was studying some 25, 28 years ago. What I will try to do in the next 20 minutes is to give you a quick high-speed overview of fertility trends in Europe in the last 2 decades approximately. I will try to set up this framework also with a little bit of a discussion of global fertility trends. And then I would like to spend the second half of my keynote discussing what we know about the drivers of these fertility shifts. I know that some of you are demographers or have background in demography, so I apologize for those of you who may know a lot about these trends. I hope that I will bring something new, especially to those of you who are from other fields than demography. This is a global picture of fertility decline, and to keep the story short, if we would look at global differences in fertility rates about 3-4 decades ago, Europe and North America would be, okay, I see the picture moving on the laptop, it's not moving behind me. Now, okay, there we go. So some 3-4 decades ago, Europe and North America would be the only regions with low or very low fertility rates. Now the picture is different. Most global regions have fertility rates around the so-called replacement level, around 2 kids per woman, or below that level, with the only major exception, which is Sub-Saharan Africa, where fertility rates are declining, but only gradually and are still much higher than in other global regions. I also fleshed out here some of the differences between countries. Today, East Asia, not Europe, is the region with by far the lowest fertility rate globally. You see the figure for China, where total fertility rate is approximately 1 or even a little bit below 1 today. So if you look at some individual countries, and this is just a very kind of crude random selection of some countries which experienced significant fertility declines in the last 2 decades, 2 facts are standing out there. First, many middle-income countries have joined the group of low fertility countries globally and have experienced sharp fertility declines, especially in the 2010s. The examples in this picture include China, Turkey, and Chile. Most of the low fertility countries also experienced significant declines, relatively sharp declines during the 2010s. Which is remarkable because it was a period of relative economic stability after the Great Recession. It seems as if the periods of crises and shocks, such as the COVID-19 pandemic or the Great Recession, are somehow bordering a break in fertility patterns when in many countries fertility rates start or continue declining after such a shock or crisis, even during the period of relative stability. Czechia here on the picture is one of the European exceptions, where many countries in Central and Eastern Europe actually had increasing fertility rates in the past decade before the COVID-19 pandemic, and then they joined the other countries with generally experiencing sharp fertility declines. No surprise, governments are worried, media are worried, many countries are worried about low fertility rates and its consequences. Among these titles, I think the more remarkable is Divan, or media titles, the most remarkable is Divan from Norway. Some 15-20 years ago, no one would expect that Norwegian Prime Minister would urge people to have more kids. That's I think, a remarkable illustration of today's situation. There are many books published on low fertility and its consequences. Most of them are negative. These are especially the red ones. And you might have noticed also some of the discussion on Twitter and among the tech billionaires like Elon Musk. The interesting thing is that many people who are worrying about low fertility are not worrying about many complex many complex outcomes of low fertility, but there is a huge obsession with the eventual population decline as a key outcome in many of these discussions and debates, which I would argue that in the world of more than 8 billion people, this should be one of the least worries about the consequences of low fertility. This is my agenda in a nutshell, and let me now go straight into some of the trends in European fertility rates. Before I do so, I would like to highlight a very important distinction, one of the obsessions of us demographers. We can measure fertility in a period perspective, estimating or computing how fertility rates evolve from 1 year to the next, from 1 month to the next. But much more precise measure of how many kids people have is to turn to fertility perspective and look at the family size of people at the end of their reproductive lives, when they are nearing or over the age of 40. This is an illustration of how big difference there could be between these two measures, taking an example of Czechia. You see how period total fertility rates can be extremely unstable and in some periods deviate largely from what cohort fertility rates of women in the peak childbearing years in these periods are. The illustration here is from the late 1990s, when total fertility rate in Czechia reached 1.13, and yet the completed fertility of women having kids in that period was about 1.8 kids per woman. This means in times of low fertility, people have a lot of flexibility to shift their childbearing to later ages, reacting on external conditions, on crises, on their personal circumstances. And this is exactly what has been happening in the last 30, 40 years across the low fertility countries. And that means the period fertility rates, which we are using too much as demographers, do give us signals about fertility trends and their responses to external changes, but they don't give us a very good and reliable picture about how many kids women or men will have at the end of their reproductive lives. So when we are discussing these numbers, like total fertility rate in China being around 0.9, total fertility rate in Czechia now being 1.28, this doesn't mean that any specific generation of Czech women will have only 1.3 kids. It doesn't mean that Chinese women at the end of their reproductive lives will have 0.9 kids. Now, with this caveat in mind, this is a picture how total fertility rates looked in Europe about 2 decades ago. Europe was neatly divided between higher fertility regions, the Western European and Nordic countries with a similar fertility to the United States, for instance, and all the other parts of Europe having considerable lower fertility rates. The fertility declines in the 2010s and during and after the COVID pandemic have changed this picture completely, as you can see here, with a great convergence across Europe, because the parts of Europe, as well as in non-European countries, the regions where fertility declines were sharpest were countries with relatively higher fertility rates. So that's one of the main features of fertility shifts in the last 15 years. If you rank countries, low fertility, high income countries, by their levels of fertility rates before the Great Recession in 2008, this is the picture you get. I only didn't put Israel there because Israel is an extremely exceptional case. And if you look at their total fertility rates 10 years later, before the COVID, 2018, and most recently in 2024, each and every of these countries experienced a remarkable fertility downturn, pushing them much closer to the average fertility rates across the low fertility countries. And the period when the change has accelerated and was happening very quickly was the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, when fertility changes were sometimes so abrupt, responding to pandemic measures, to economic changes. Later on, after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, also to rising inflation and uncertainty, that we couldn't use any more annual data to understand how quickly fertility was shifting and in what direction. So we started using monthly data to estimate monthly fertility trends, monthly period fertility rates. And I cannot go into details about this picture, besides saying that there were also periods of fertility upturns around 2021 in most countries, that countries within broader European regions experience remarkably similar fertility shifts from one month to the next, as you can see in the second panel for German-speaking countries. So the main causes of these changes cannot be seen in individual countries, obviously, but there were also huge regional differences, with one region where fertility rates declined most sharply after 2019. You see it here on the map in the dark red. These are Eastern European countries, plus Czechia. I don't know whether it's a coincidence that these countries are all clustered relatively close to Ukraine or received significant numbers of Ukrainian refugees. Besides that region, fertility rates declined pretty much in each and every country, possibly with the exception of Serbia. If we rank countries globally from the lowest fertility levels today, we see that European countries do have low but not extremely low fertility rates. All the red bar countries which extremely low fertility rates today are in East Asia. Nevertheless, every global region now has at least one country with a total fertility rate below 1.3, a lowest low or very low fertility level, which is considered as one of the important thresholds of very low or extreme low fertility. So what do we know about these fertility declines? I think the speakers before me already mentioned the remarkable shift to delayed parenthood, and I mentioned that this keeps impacting period total fertility rates. So you see here an illustration of the mean age at first birth in different countries in Europe, also in South Korea, and this trend keeps continuing. Many countries now have the mean age at first birth among mothers around 30 or over 30. Some East Asian countries and Spain and Italy are even quite above that threshold. South Korean women have first child around the age of 33. What does it mean? That means that they have less space left to realize their fertility plans in the future if they start having their first child in their early to mid 30s. Some women may not be able to have their second birth if they plan it, or the third birth. Another remarkable thing we see in the last decade is that the kind of mechanism which we saw in Europe, that fertility rates are postponed to later ages, but then women in their 30s are having increasing fertility rates. This mechanism has kind of stalled or stopped in the last decade. We don't see much of a fertility recovery in most European countries after the age of 30 in the 2010s and after the COVID-19 pandemic. So fertility rates are still declining among women below the age of 30 or 32, but they are not recovering much at higher reproductive ages. And this is, technically speaking, the reason why total fertility rates were declining. Now, demographers have a lot of obsession with measurements, and we also have ways how to estimate total fertility rates, adjusting them for the speed of fertility postponement, using different indicators of tempo-adjusted fertility to give us an idea where the cohort fertility rates might be going in the future. And I don't want to comment in depth about this illustration for 4 European countries besides saying one thing. Since 2020-21, since the start of the COVID and the subsequent crises, it's not only conventional total fertility rates, it's also the tempo-adjusted fertility rates which were declining in Europe, which means that the current fertility decline is not only because women would be postponing parenthood to later ages and then catching up with their postponed plans. There is a genuine decline, genuine component in this decline, suggesting that cohort fertility rates will also go down among generations of women having kids today. And one of the layers or one of the indicators suggesting that fertility behavior is changing is the increase in childlessness across low fertility countries. This is a picture at the age of 35, so that's not the end of reproductive period, but in most countries we see that more and more women over time are remaining childless at this age, and if they plan to have kids, they don't have so much space to realize them. In Spain and Japan today, 4 out of 10 women are childless at the age of 35. So what are some of the reasons behind the shifts in fertility rates? As a demographer, I like to start thinking first about what we call often proximate determinants, whether people have sex, whether they live in partnerships, whether they are using contraception. And here this is more a curiosity because we don't have a good picture of that, but we still need, most people still conceive children through sex. And there is an evidence across countries, more in East Asia than in Europe, but also in Europe, that people are having sex less often and they start later in life. But much more important determinant or factor in declining fertility rates is that people are entering partnerships at later ages, both cohabiting partnerships and marriages. And research across different low fertility countries suggests that a significant part of fertility decline in the last 15 years is because more people are living single or in less stable partnerships than before. The interesting question is whether infertility might be affecting people's fertility rates or realization of their reproductive plans. I like to show this picture that's for the United States, where there are surveys over time which look at the share of people who state that they have infertility issues, that they were not able to conceive after 1 year of trying to conceive. And there are two messages. One, infertility rates are remarkably stable within individual age groups. So many of the discussions suggesting that infertility rates are increasing over time are probably related to the fact that people are trying to conceive at later ages, but within individual age groups we do not observe any significant trend. But then when you look at the pattern line, these are childless women aged 35 to 39. You see how much higher infertility rate is among this group of women, and of course this group has been increasing over time. So that's also a kind of warning indicator for the future. Now, I cannot avoid all kinds of indicators of economic uncertainty, which are often being discussed as one of the reasons for declining fertility rates. One piece of evidence is very clear-cut. The periods of crises and shocks are periods when many people tend to postpone childbearing plans into the future. This was also the evidence for the Great Recession in Europe and elsewhere around 2008 to 2010, when fertility rates in Europe declined especially fast in Southern European countries. But what about after the Great Recession? 2010s were the period of relative economic prosperity, low unemployment rates. But we have the housing crisis in many places. The housing prices have gone up during the 2010s and in the first half of 2020s. And there is an increasing evidence suggesting that unaffordable housing is one of the important factors behind, or explanatory factors behind, declining fertility rates. The evidence is not always clear-cut, because in some settings, more expensive houses are actually correlated with somewhat higher fertility rates, probably because people who already own a house feel confident about the future and are happy with the rising housing prices, with their ownership becoming more valuable. But there is a clear evidence that the increase in rental prices is negatively correlated with fertility rates in many countries. Regions within countries with more expensive housing have lower fertility rates or sharper fertility declines. And of course, the barrier of housing prices may be making it difficult for many people to jump on the housing market and to start a family. Income stagnation among young people, which occurred during the 2010s in times of economic prosperity, is another factor which partly explains fertility declines. In European countries where younger people faced relative decline in their income or stagnation in their income, these countries had sharper fertility declines in the 2010s than countries with increasing incomes. And on the little map in the corner, you can see countries with biggest relative declines in income among younger people in dark red and orange. So Central Eastern European countries where fertility rates were increasing during the 2010s are exceptional within European context in having increasing income of younger people in that period. And then we move towards the COVID-19 pandemic, where one factor which was most strongly explaining decline in fertility rates, especially in the later stage of the COVID and around the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was rising inflation. So places and periods with rising inflation or sharper rise in inflation were the places where fertility rates declined the most. Moving on from the economic factors, we increasingly see the evidence that it's not only the economy why younger people have fewer kids. Surveys across different countries show that younger generations have lower fertility intentions and ideals, as illustrated here on this complicated picture for France, where young people surveyed in 2025 had much lower fertility intentions, lifetime fertility intentions, around 1.9 kids on average, than the generation surveyed of young people surveyed 20 years earlier, whose fertility intentions were around 2.4, 2.5 on average. And the same trend for fertility ideals. Illustrating another illustration for Sweden shows that childless couples are much less sincere whether they want to have ever child in the future. And this illustration for Austria shows that many young people, both men and women, are not sure whether they want to have kids. Many of them are somewhere in the middle, either saying that they are not certain or saying probably yes, probably no. And this picture would look very different if we would have the same survey 3 or 4 decades ago. People say that parenthood is a big burden. Even in countries with very strong support systems, like Norway, many young people say parenthood is strenuous, it's difficult to raise children, the responsibilities is difficult. So the image of becoming parents is also becoming an image of a big kind of burden. Going beyond these factors, I don't have much time to delve into policies, and I think many discussions here will be about the policies. Let me just emphasize one message about the policy experience in European countries in the last 20 years. On the one hand, there is a positive correlation between government spending on family policies and fertility rates across low-income, high-income, low-fertility countries, as shown in this picture. However, when one looks at the evidence for different countries which tried to enact pronatalist policies, expand expenditures on parents and families, like the Hungarian experience of the last 15 years of Orbán's government, these countries essentially failed in lifting fertility rates. These countries essentially failed in bringing fertility rates higher than in their neighboring comparative countries where such policies were not enacted, as you can see in the picture of Hungary here. Now let me move to some concluding discussion about the future of fertility. So one message is that there is no single explanation or no single driver which would account for falling fertility rates over the last 15 years. It's a combination of different factors, of structural constraints, changing preferences, changing partnership behaviors, external shocks, but also negative future expectations, and possibly increasingly negative impact of delayed reproduction, plus sometimes specific factors in individual countries. The evidence we see across the board in higher and middle income countries is that young people are looking negatively into the future. They don't expect to achieve the economic standards of their parental generations in many places. And of course they are worried about all the crises we are going through and shocks, not only the economic ones, but also the climate change. Neatly summarizing the view of the future in the article of New York Times, Sussman argued that young people's inescapable and crushing sense that the future is too uncertain makes it almost impossible to make a lifelong commitment of parenthood. Moving a little bit beyond the factors I discussed, we not only experience changing in partnership and intimate behaviors, there is also an elephant in the room things which we are not able to study properly because of the lack of data and instruments to study them, the impact of social media and their impact on our lifestyles and partnering and dating, but also coming in the next years, of course, the impact of artificial intelligence. It seems that for the younger generation today, it's not very cool thing to have kids because they associate it with sacrifice and with a burden very often. I skip these slides because my time is off. One last message related to the worries about the population. If you look at Europe today and you correlate fertility rates with the rates of population decline, there is no correlation at all. This is because migration has become an important mechanism behind population growth or decline in Europe, often with a stronger impact than lower or higher fertility rates. Thank you very much for your attention.